Hi, we're here today with Zeynep Tufekci, who is a fellow at the Center for Information Technology at Princeton and also an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina. And I've been paying attention to Professor Tufekci since she got onto Twitter, since I'm very interested in sociologists who know something about social media. Many more of them now than there were when I first started. And in particular, there was a lot of controversy online when Malcolm Gladwell started writing about Arab Spring, and a lot of headline writers wrote about Twitter revolutions. So we're interested in youth and civic engagement, and it seems like the place of social media in the revolutions that took place in North Africa and the Middle East might be a good place to start. So I know that social media revolution or Twitter revolution is an inaccurate way to describe it, and I think you made a good case versus Gladwell that saying it is trivial is also inaccurate. How would you characterize it?
Right. I mean, I think naming any revolution after any single cause will be trivial. I mean, revolutions are always multi-causal events. So when you say, here's the cause, somebody else will come along and say, well, here are other factors that play the role. And that will always be true. There's just no revolution worth studying in human history that you could just reduce down to a single thing. So that much, yes, that to the degree that you don't want to label them by single thing, yes. But Malcolm Gladwell's analysis was just ignorant of both the realities of what happened in Arab Spring, which it was written slightly before that. But it was also ignorant of realities of how social media operates. I mean, it was written, in retrospect, I look at it and I think it's written by somebody who neither uses these tools nor understands them, nor really studied the research on collective action as thoroughly, probably because he also didn't understand how these tools work, so he didn't know what to look at. So I think after a couple years, I'm even more confident saying that his predictions in that early article, "The Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted," were just flat out wrong, because we have seen all the things that people think social media cannot do. And in fact, that's the simplistic analysis. Social media space is a very complicated space. It does a lot of things, but crucially speaking, it allows for peer-to-peer connectivity, horizontal connectivity. And in the case of the Arab countries, it allowed for this kind of horizontal connectivity in countries where the public sphere was very tightly controlled from top down, right? So for decades, the autocrats ruling these countries had kept a very harsh lid on what could be spoken about in public. And this was broken by Al Jazeera and satellite television in general. So that was one part of what broke it. And it was also broken by Facebook. It was also broken by Twitter. The gatekeepers who controlled what could be said and talked about in public were no longer able to keep that kind of lid. And that absolutely had an impact, because all sorts of things that people were previously they knew, but were not really talking with each other, started being talked about on social media. And that brings us to a mechanism of revolution that's been studied a lot, which is called pluralistic ignorance. That's the case in which where, let's say you're sitting in a lecture, and it's a crowded lecture. You're sitting by yourself, and there's a couple hundred people. You're really bored. You think it's just awful, and you really don't think this is a good lecture. If you think you're the only person who thinks that, you're quite unlikely to get up and do anything. Whereas if there's a back channel and people are talking to each other and everybody's saying, oh, geez, this is really awful, that can cascade into an action. So when you study history of revolutions, this kind of pluralistic ignorance before social media, there's always a role for breaking of pluralistic ignorance when people realize, oh, wait a minute, I am not the only one who thinks this way. You can look at street demonstrations as a way to break that kind of control over the public sphere too. So I would see street demonstrations as a form of small media, as a form of people communicating to each other hey, you're not alone. Because if you think about it, street demonstrations, even on the most participatory revolution in our history, which is Iran 1979, in human history, revolutions are usually conducted by a couple percent of the population. And Iran is probably, the height of it is like 10% of the population. That's still not that large a number. We're talking couple percent of the population in the street. What does it do? I mean, why can't, how is it that 2 to 3% or 1% of the population can overthrow a whole government? Well, what it does is, it's not just by force. It is also by the sheer demonstration that here we are, and we don't like this government. And these usually occur in a situation that otherwise you just don't have control. You can't just get on television and say, or you can't get on radio and say, we don't like this government. So you can think of Facebook and Twitter and other social media tools as extending people's capacity to say, we don't like this revolution. So when there was a Facebook page for We Are Khalid Said, which called for the revolution. And the process by which they did this is spelled out in Wael Ghanim's book, Revolution 2.0. He was the administrator of the page. And basically, they said, here's January 25, we want a revolution. And they sent out an evite. They sent out an invite to the revolution. And it must have been the first revolution in human history where people were RSVPing to a revolution saying, oh yeah, I'll be there. And that sounds like, it's funny, it's cute, but do you understand the significance of this when you realize that January 25, 2010, there were people on the street protesting too. January 25 is a police day, which also people used to protest. And last year, in 2010, there were 150 people. And they were outnumbered by, 3,000 police. So on January 25, 2011, when you see hundreds of thousands of people RSVPing and saying, oh yeah, I'm going to the street, you might not feel comfortable enough to join 150, but you feel heck of a lot more comfortable joining a couple 100,000 people. Now, of course, you don't know how many of them will show up. You don't know if it's going to fizzle out. There's always a risk. There's no such thing as risk-free activism in an authoritarian state. Of course, there's a risk to anything you do. Social media is not removing your risk. In some ways, it introduces novel risk. It's other ways it reduces some risk. So I'm not talking about risk at all. But it certainly changes the calculation for collective action. If you can visibly see, and in a network like Facebook where where offline, online identities have merged closely, so the people who are RSVPing. You're looking at your Facebook page, and and in Egypt, people Facebook friend each other a lot. So people, Facebook friend their workplace friends and acquaintances and their cousins, and they have large families, and you friended your 8 cousins, and next your 8 cousins' workplace acquaintances are friending you. So all of a sudden, you're looking at your social network, and you're seeing 30 of them or 50 of them, or 100 of them have said, yeah, I'm going to the revolution. So to think that this has no impact means it's just inconceivable, of course. And it comes up. It comes up in the study that I published using surveys done by Engine Room, which is just a great collective that works on collecting this kind of data. It shows up in all sorts of accounts. And in fact, while there, of course, have been revolutions before Facebook or before anything else, when you look at history of modern revolutions, and I'll take that back to the French Revolution, you see the mode of communication, or lack thereof, always plays a key role in how it does and does not play out. If you look at the 1848 wave of revolution, you see the new telegraph and railroads. Railroads are also a mode of communication, playing a key role. When you look at when you look at 1989, you see the East European revolutions. You also see the communication, sort of the Radio Free Europe and all the kind of ways of the Summits.press. And of course, these are not, and it's just sort of silly to discuss, do these replace face-to-face? Of course not. Nothing replaces face-to-face. It's all a mix. In a modern society, we talk face-to-face, and we sometimes talk on the phone, and there are broadcast mediums like television, and there are semi-broadcast mediums now through digital media. So they all become this big mess. It's a complex mess. And social media and digital media in the past 10 years or so have introduced a dimension of horizontal connectivity that simply was not there before. It is not more television. It is not more radio. It is also not more telephone. It is not, it has some aspects that look like television. It has some aspects that look like radio or even, telephone, but it is none of those things. It has all sorts of new affordances, new ways of doing things. And so getting the word out about people's level of dissent was, I think, important. Another way in which it was important is the role it played in breaking censorship. So before, you would have a little uprising, let's say in Tunisia in 2009 in Gafsa, which is a little mining town. There was indeed an uprising, similar to the one that set off the Arab Spring in late 2010, early 2011. There was a small uprising against corrupt local hiring practices by the government. And what did the government do? It locked down the town, it arrested the men, it kicked out the journalists, and it waited it out. And it could do that because in Tunisia in 2009, there were about 28,000 Facebook users. So there wasn't peer-to-peer connectivity. If Gafsa was locked down and the journalists were kicked out, that was it. You can come back to another event in 2009 in Gaza when there was an invasion by Israel. There were 2 journalists in the whole place. There were 2 journalists in all of Gaza. And in 2010, end of 2010, when Mohamed Bouazizi self-immolated, killed himself, there were attempts. The government played the same playbook. They tried to close down Sidi Bouzid, kick out the journalists, lock down, arrest some people, wait it out. But they could not suppress the news. There were 2 million Facebook users, and there was a very well-connected Tunisian blogosphere by then. It had really flourished in those 2 years, so it could not lock it down. In 2012, when Israel and there was still conflict between Israel and the Gaza authorities, I mean, within like day or two of the whole thing breaking into the world scene, I watched at least dozens, if not hundreds, of Egyptian citizen journalists, experienced ones, sneak into Gaza from the border. Of course, one change was that since the revolution had happened, the Gaza border had not been sealed, as well as lots of professional journalists. So in 2012, when there was again discussion, will Israel do a ground invasion or not, one factor they would have to consider was that there would be hundreds of citizen journalists. See, I'm doing these comparisons, 2009 Tunisia, 2011 Tunisia, 2009 Gaza, 2012 Gaza, to say that it changes the political calculation. Of course, it changes. If citizen journalists are there, then the narrative is going to be different, then the international attention is going to be different. The way that the global publics interact with it will be different. Now, you might bring up Syria as a counterexample, which shows how these things all play in a particular context. Syria is a client state of Russia, and it is increasingly an unfortunate civil war of sorts. It started more as a political, it's getting more and more sectarian. So there isn't as much leverage from Western publics to Syria compared with Egypt, which was a direct U.S. client state, because Syria is a client state of Russia, and appealing to the Russian public. I mean, Russia is an authoritarian state itself. So I'm just sort of giving this example to say, in all these conflicts, social media is playing a role. In Syria, for example, the rebels are using Skype to coordinate among themselves, and they're using YouTube videos to raise funds from rich Gulf personalities who are funding a lot of these insurgent efforts. So even there, it's playing a role, but it's playing a different role than it played in Egypt, because Syria is a different country than Egypt. So, but there's no situation in which it's playing no role. Right? It's an important addition to the way politics and conflict and everything else happens. There's no one way in which it does many things, and it depends on the context of where you're looking at it. So
that's an amazing quick overview of a complex
it's very
situation.
complex. Yeah.
We're at DML. We're particularly interested in youth involvement with civic engagement and social media. And while Gonim is relatively young, what do you have to say about the role of youth in these events with the Facebook pages and the YouTube and the other social media? Were they in the vanguard or of that or
they were
not?
absolutely an important part of it. They weren't the only part. I mean, there were millions of people in the streets, so it wasn't just sort of youth on Twitter. There were a lot of organizations, say in Egypt, in Tunisia, but I would argue that they were crucial in many ways. For one thing, they were very good at citizen journalism. There's a lot of young people who are also interested in photography anyway. They're interested in storytelling. They're interested in self-expression. And if you remember the places like Egypt and Tunisia, they're ruled by autocrats who have been in power for 30, 40 years. So these young people wanted to participate in their country's civics, but they were cut off. They were not allowed to, they're treated, even though they're competent and they have so much to contribute, just part of the culture of that region also is that they were treated like, they weren't even, children, I'm going to say, but like non-entities. And in some ways, this was a situation in which their agency, they reclaimed a lot of, they reclaimed agency by being very active, being good at what they do know what to do, which was organizing, storytelling, communicating their story to Western journalists, which of course helps take the stage because these autocrats also, especially Tunisia and Egypt, which were Western client states more, cared a lot about how they looked. I mean, Tunisia and Egypt, they're also both dependent on tourism, so their image is pretty significant to the ruling elites. So these kids were able to say, look, we represent this country as well, and this is a dictatorship, this is an autocratic state, and they were able to tell stories of repression, they were able to tell their own stories. And in fact, when you watch something on television, you don't really get to see the personalities, whereas if you watch something like that on Twitter, you get to see lots of individual people, and you get to realize, they're just they're part of global youth culture. If you talk to a lot of these people, and I mean across the political spectrum, I'm not just talking about the westernized liberal kids, but even if you talk to some of the sort of Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan youth, they're also part of global youth culture in some ways. So there are ways in which they will relate to you, and you can relate to them even if there are significant differences in the end in some of the worldviews. I think they were able to connect with the world, and it's still, you see, Egypt still remains a place in which the youth, revolutions are difficult. The French Revolution took about 50 years to settle down, maybe 60 at best. So they're in year 2, and it's difficult, and some of them are demoralized, while many of them are, let's say, a little upset that it's not faster. There's all sorts of issues remaining, and it's going to take a while for sure, as it did in, Western countries. But they are still, I see them very actively engaged in their country's future. So it's a way through which that young people were able to express themselves when they had been cut off. And in some ways, we saw this, I think, a little bit with the 2008 campaign, presidential campaign. It had a lot of youth involvement by kids who, young first-time voters. There was a lot of that. In 2012, we also have significant youth vote, although it was a little more top-down in the sense that it was more pull organized by the campaign rather than the 2008 push, which just kind of swelled up more like a movement. But I think in terms of youth participation, Middle Eastern countries right now are ahead of a lot of more developed democracies where we have the rights, but we don't have as many people sort of used to the idea, wait, I can try to do something with all the rights I have.
Well, I think certainly the events that you're describing are a model, give the idea to future young people that they potentially do have power and that there are tools that they can use to engage outside of what many view as a corrupt traditional political process.
Well, I would argue that the Egyptian revolution also showed that you can't just ignore the corrupt traditional process either, because the corrupt traditional process has a lot of power. So the trick is, how do you remain engaged and confront at times the corrupt political process also while building alternatives? And this is a difficult question for any generation to navigate, and this one won't be the first one. It's, this is always part of the issue. Sometimes young people want to build their own little alternative, and then corrupt traditional politics comes and eats it up. But these tools definitely give ways in which they can empower themselves, whether to create alternatives or whether to find ways to confront the corrupt traditional methods. Nobody has a magic bullet, and there are very strong institutional structures in place. But if you want to take them on, it used to be you needed a lot of money even to begin. Even to try something, you needed a lot of money. And we're at a place in history where to try something, you need effort, and you might need money later on, but you can still start and see if something goes somewhere. And that, I think, is that realization occurred in the Middle East, and that may or may not be coming here soon, but that's the realization, is that you can organize without having a huge amount of resources to begin with. If you get successful, you might need resources, but if you get successful, you might be able to get them.
Fantastic. I could go on for hours, but I think where we are right now is probably a good place to stop, and I think that this will be useful for people, whether they are young people or not, who are interested in the role of youth, social media, and civic engagement. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.